This is a short reel.
Welcome to the short reel. This is Charles. And yes, you're stuck with just me again this week. Ryan is off putting the finishing touches on his veterinarian's hearse for this year's Cannonball Run. Of course, we'll miss him, but I have a feeling that this is his year. I think he's going to win it all.
What do you do when you've done it all? Cannonball. 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 Cannonball.
Cannonball! Whew, sorry, that got away from me a little bit. On tonight's episode, we're going to talk about the truth, where we find it, what it means, and ultimately, with regard to movies, if it's even really important. So let's get going. In last week's episode, I was a little testy, let's say, when it came to talking about Dillinger, because of all the factual inaccuracies in the film. And Ryan gently lectured me for being that way. Honestly, I don't know if our producer Markham left that part in or not, but Ryan did get on my ass a little about it. From Ryan's perspective, we should have approached the movie more on its own terms, rather than letting the real events that inspired it cloud my attitude toward it. And after giving it some thought, I can honestly say that I agree with him on a certain level. Dillinger is a really solid movie. I really like it for what it is, and I might have said all that last week. I just don't want to listen to my own voice enough to go back and find out. Just in case, though, I'll say it again. Dillinger is a good movie. But thinking about that episode made me consider a question. What does John Milius, as a filmmaker, owe me as a film viewer when it comes to being factually accurate? Nothing, right? He wanted to create a myth about John Dillinger on film, and he did it. Case closed. Sure, there were some puzzling decisions about how he framed certain events, or how he changed people's ages so drastically, or how he characterized their fates. But it doesn't say, based on a true story on the poster. So there was no pretense of telling a truth with this film. The movie was supposed to do two things. It was supposed to replicate the success of Arthur Penn's movie Bonnie and Clyde, and it was also supposed to show that John Milius could direct and edit together action scenes like a real pro. And he most definitely could do that. As we covered last week, the action scenes in Dillinger are excellent. They're well conceived, they're well choreographed, they're well edited. No, the movie did not become the cultural touchstone that Bonnie and Clyde was, but it did possibly make a small profit at the box office. Hollywood's creative accounting system always makes that math a little fuzzy, right? But in the end, who among us cares if it made money or not, since it's a good movie? And since it's a good movie, who cares if it isn't necessarily true to the actual events? Ben Johnson's Melvin Purvis bears very little resemblance to the real Melvin Purvis. But the story that Milius presents on screen is compelling. An old lawman trying to match wits with a younger, more charming outlaw, and seemingly losing in the court of public opinion. The story is as much about an aging man shifting his code of ethics to catch an outlaw as it is about crime ultimately not paying. So who cares if the real Purvis was actually about 4 months younger than Dillinger when the time frame depicted in the film took place? Yes, the real story has its own compelling angles, but is it any more film-worthy than the story that Milius told in Dillinger? Honestly, I don't think so. And does it matter if the real Melvin Purvis wasn't even present when most of the gangsters depicted in the movie were arrested or killed? After thinking about it, I don't think that matters either. The Melvin Purvis in Dillinger isn't a representation of a real individual. He is a composite of the entirety of the FBI during those tumultuous, crime-ridden months between 1933 and 34. Ben Johnson's Purvis represents both sides of what the fledgling FBI was at the time. What most of us tend to forget about the early years of J. Edgar Hoover's remade FBI is that the ranks were staffed with white Christian accountants and lawyers who had no real experience in law enforcement. But they were young enough and straight-laced enough to be cowed by their director's strict rules, and they also understood how powerful the press would be in gaining their boss's favor, whether it be in the newspapers, in newsreels, or in radio, which was really coming into its own in the early 30s. At the street level, though, these agents had to rely on local law enforcement or marshals to make arrests because legally they could only make a quote-unquote citizen's arrest. And they weren't even allowed to carry firearms. In fact, the vast majority of FBI field agents did not have the ability to make arrests or carry firearms until Congress passed a series of anti-crime bills in May and June of 1934. The last of these laws went into effect just over a month before John Dillinger was gunned down outside of the Biograph Theater. But the Melvin Purvis in the movie actually carries a gun throughout that movie. So you might be asking, how could that be an accurate representation of the Bureau at that time? Well, in my mind, this is a nod to the other side of the FBI from those early Hoover years. You see, because most of the agents had no law enforcement experience and no facility with, or as we said, legal authority to carry firearms, Hoover did sprinkle in a few former sheriffs and police officers that the other agents informally called the cowboys. And while these men did satisfy two of Hoover's major requirements for hiring agents, being that they were white and Christian, they were conveniently allowed by the usually dictatorial FBI director to skirt or simply ignore other requirements, like having a college degree or, carrying weapons. So while the real Purvis was not an aging, gunslinging outlaw, the Purvis on screen represents both aspects of the real man mixed with elements of those cowboys from the modern FBI's formative years. So in a sense, it is true on more of a symbolic level. But what about the elements of Dillinger that are just absolutely not true? The scenes that are simply used to bolster the Purvis character as a no-nonsense lawman, but have very little in common with the facts. As a moviegoer, I can say now, I'm mostly okay with it. If that question had come up during our discussion in Dillinger, I would have offered a very different answer. But since then, I've thought about a couple of my favorite movies. Steven Soderbergh's Kafka and Orson Welles' F for Fake. Both of these films deal with the stories of real people in very creative ways. In Kafka, writer Lem Dobbs and director Steven Soderbergh blend the real and the imagined by putting author Franz Kafka at the center of a surreal film that combines elements from many of his classic stories with events and details from his life to create a work that is more film noir than biopic. Similarly, Orson Welles' F for Fake is a groundbreaking, even today, a groundbreaking filmic essay that collapses real stories of real people into the very idea of fakery, of what it means to be a fake, and who and what defines what is real and what is not. And that film folds in on itself until you realize that it too is ultimately the most effective type of lie, one that is woven through with traces of the truth. Thinking about these movies, I had to look back at Dillinger and ask myself, why am I holding that film to a different standard than these films that I love? And honestly, I didn't have an answer, other than maybe because I don't necessarily agree with or particularly like Milius as a person from what I know of him. But that's not fair to the film, is it? I don't think so, but honestly, I don't know. I mean, I could be responding to the capital L, capital O Law and Order aspect of Dillinger that paints justice as being at the end of a smoking barrel of a gun. And maybe that then comes out as me harping on the facts about the film, its factual accuracy, big, small, whatever, the stuff that he gets quote-unquote wrong. I'm not really sure. Here's the thing, though. In the end, I know that one of the central tenets of podcasting about movies or writing about them on the internet is to make a judgment, however rash or uninformed it might be, about a film or a group of films, and then you have to rank them, and then you move on to the next clickbait headline. But take a look at your social media feeds. That's just a fact. But it's not a betrayal to see a movie you loved as a child and realize from an adult's perspective that there were heinous elements in it that you didn't recognize on first viewing. It's not a crime to have nostalgia for a movie, while also realizing that it's either not particularly a well-told story, or that it contains things that you disagree with as you get older and hopefully wiser. And it's certainly not a crime to see a movie once at any age, and then see different or deeper meanings in it on repeated viewings, or to change your mind about how you feel about something you missed the first time around. As someone who loves movies and the experience of seeing them and talking about them and analyzing them, I am constantly reevaluating how I view movies and how I feel about them. This means that I will change my mind about individual films or filmmakers. And by internet standards, that means that I will be quote-unquote wrong a lot. But I reserve the right to be wrong if it means that I can change my mind about how I see a film as I go through my life. And I think we all should reserve that right. Finally tonight, let's take a moment to talk about research sources. The reason that I knew the difference between fact and fiction and how events were portrayed in Dillinger was because I had done some background reading on that 1933-34 crime wave. Scores of books have been written about the various robbers and killers and criminals roaming the back roads of the Midwest and Southwest of those years. But I want to highlight two that seemed very well researched and thorough and put the whole era in context for me. First and foremost is Bryan Burroughs' excellent Public Enemies, on which Michael Mann's film of the same name was partly based. Burrough presents the events of that initial war on crime in a way that I've never seen in books about that era. As much as we think of the exploits of Bonnie and Clyde and John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson and Pretty Boy Floyd and the Barker Karpus gang all taking place in their own little vacuums, the fact of the matter is, they were operating at around exactly the same time, sometimes within just a couple of miles of one another. Burroughs' book is riveting, and reading it feels like you're binging a deeply researched Netflix limited series or something. It's a truly amazing work that I would highly recommend picking up if you want to know more about the real stories from that time. Some of those stories are so insane that if someone like John Milius or Michael Mann or any other filmmaker had committed them to celluloid, they'd be called liars. Which brings me to the other book that I found valuable. R.D. Morgan's fascinating The Tri-State Terror, The Life and Crimes of Wilbur Underhill. After seeing the Underhill arrest scene in Dillinger and realizing how much it seemed like an homage to the ending of Wellman's The Public Enemy, I started wondering about the true story of Underhill's arrest, which in turn led me to Morgan's book. Now, okay, if you're someone who reads a book with a red pen looking for grammatical and formatting errors, as I sometimes do, I admit that, this book might not be for you. But I found it to be an extensively researched work on a figure that even the FBI itself wouldn't really take credit for killing for decades, possibly for some shady reasons. According to R.D. Morgan, Underhill was probably the first criminal actually killed by the FBI. At the time, it was called the BOI. But he was killed, I think, about 6 months before they were legally allowed to carry guns. The agents were legally allowed to carry guns. So Morgan theorizes that that's one of the reasons why they didn't necessarily tout the Underhill case as much as they did some other stuff like Al Capone or things that they were even just tangentially involved in. I don't know the reasons for that, but what I can tell you is that Morgan's book is worth reading for the account of Underhill's capture and death all on its own. That scene bears absolutely no resemblance to what happened in Dillinger. And I understand why from a filmmaking perspective, because of budgetary concerns, time concerns. The movie's not about Wilbur Underhill ultimately. So you can understand why someone like Milius, who's making a movie, just wants to say, okay, here's a real name. Purvis is a real name. Sure, they work together, but we need this scene to show what kind of a lawman Purvis is and how courageous he is and how cool under pressure he is. And so let's just do this. But the real capture and ultimately killing of Wilbur Underhill is so astonishing and so cinematic that I hope someone makes a film about it someday. We'll include links to both of these books and the films discussed earlier in this episode in our show notes.
Coming soon to this drive-in theater.
Next week, gas up your cars, load your guns, and pack your marbles, because we're going on the run with teenage fugitives in The Legend of Billie Jean and Bobby Joe and the Outlaw. That's it for the short reel this week. You can connect with us by following us on social media at All Night Drive-In on Twitter and Instagram, by searching the All Night Drive-In Picture Show on Facebook, and by emailing us at allnightdriveinpictureshow@gmail.com. Please subscribe to and rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher if possible. And more importantly, tell your friends. Sneaking your friends into the show in the trunk is definitely allowed at the All Night Drive-In Picture Show. I mean, Stubbs probably won't like it, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So we'll see you next week on the All Night Drive-In Picture Show. Thanks for listening.
The Short Reel is edited and produced by Markham Harvey. Our theme song is by Burning Mirror and edited by The Night Watch. I'm your announcer, Lila Pseudonym. This has been a Clown Business Coalition production. Thank you and good night.